A racist lie cost this black waiter his job, but what he did next exposed shocking truths and sparked a fight against injustice you won't believe. The twist at the end will leave you speechless. James Carter had worked at the upscale Riverside Bistro for nearly 6 years. Known for his radiant smile and gentle demeanor, James, a 28-year-old black waiter, was adored by regulars and respected by his co-workers. The restaurant, perched along the bustling streets of a mid-sized southern town, had become a second home to him. It was here he built friendships, memorized the names of customers' children, and shared countless laughs with the kitchen staff. James wasn't just a waiter. He was a lifeline to many customers who came in, not only for the food, but for his warm presence. Widowed retirees, busy professionals, and even families with rowdy children all felt at ease under his attentive care. His laughter would ring through the restaurant, a reminder that even in a high-pressure job, kindness could prevail. But behind that smile was a man who had weathered storms most couldn't imagine. Growing up in the shadow of systemic racism, James had fought his way through prejudice, doubters, and barriers. Every shift was a testament to his resilience. He believed in hard work, fairness, and most importantly, treating others with respect, even when that respect wasn't returned. On a crisp Thursday evening, the restaurant was packed, the kind of night that demanded everyone be at the top of their game. James moved from table to table with his usual grace, balancing plates and refilling drinks with precision. At one corner table sat a middle-aged couple he didn't recognize, a man with a sharp suit and a woman with a piercing stare. From the moment they sat down, James felt their eyes on him, scrutinizing his every move. He greeted them warmly. "Good evening. My name is James, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some drinks?" The man grunted, barely looking up from his menu. The woman's gaze lingered on him for a moment too long. She didn't smile. "Just water for now," she said curtly. James nodded, brushing off the tension. Over the years, he had learned how to navigate difficult customers with grace. Some people walked into restaurants carrying the weight of their bad days, or their biases. Either way, he always did his best to make them feel welcome. As the evening wore on, the couple's demeanor didn't improve. They whispered to each other, glanced at James with disdain, and barely acknowledged his attempts at conversation. James couldn't help but notice how the woman's tone turned sharper when addressing him than it did when speaking to her partner. At one point, as he cleared their empty plates, the woman made a pointed comment. "Do you even know how to serve properly? Or is this your first job?" The remark stung, but James kept his composure. "I'm sorry if I've done anything to upset you. Is there something I can do to improve your experience tonight?" The woman scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Just bring the check," James complied, quietly hoping the ordeal would end once they left. He dropped the check on their table and wished them a good night. But the man muttered something under his breath, a word James couldn't make out but didn't need to. The tone said it all. As they left, James exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the weight of the interaction. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with difficult customers, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He leaned against the kitchen counter for a moment, steadying himself before moving on to the next table. But what James didn't know was that his life was about to change forever. The next morning, he was called into his manager's office. The air felt heavy as his boss, Mr. Grant, an older white man with a furrowed brow, avoided eye contact. "James," he began, "we've received a serious complaint about you from a customer last night." James's heart sank. "What kind of complaint?" "They said you were rude, inattentive, and made them feel uncomfortable. They even accused you of inappropriate behavior," Mr. Grant said, his tone laced with unease. James's mind raced. Inappropriate behavior? Uncomfortable? He knew these accusations were false. But he also knew how quickly accusations could spiral out of control, especially when the accuser carried privilege, and the accused did not. "I've never treated anyone here with anything but respect," James said, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "I know, James," Mr. Grant replied, finally meeting his eyes. "But this couple is threatening to go public if we don't act. They've written to corporate. I have no choice but to let you go." Those words hit James like a punch to the gut. "You're firing me? Over one false complaint?" "I'm sorry," Mr. Grant muttered, avoiding his gaze again. James stood frozen. The job he had poured his heart into, the place where he had built a small piece of stability in a chaotic world, was slipping away because of one racist lie. He wanted to scream, to plead, to fight back, but in that moment, all he could do was walk out of the office with his dignity intact. As he stepped outside into the brisk morning air, James felt the weight of the injustice pressing on his chest. He had seen this kind of prejudice before, but it was different when it came crashing into your own life, stripping you of something you'd worked so hard to build. But as the tears threatened to fall, James clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let this be the end. Somewhere deep inside, a spark ignited. What James would do next would uncover truths no one was prepared for, and change everything. James sat on the worn steps of his apartment complex that evening, staring out at the dim streetlights. His termination replayed in his mind like a broken record. The memory of the couple's cold stares and the unjust accusations churned in his chest. A bitter reminder of how quickly his years of hard work had been erased. His phone buzzed beside him. It was a text from his younger sister, Maya. "Hey, big bro. Hope your shift went well. Call me when you get off." James clenched the phone in his hand, guilt washing over him. Maya and their mum depended on him to help with bills, especially after his father passed. He didn't have the heart to tell her yet. He wasn't even sure how to process it himself, but as he stared at the screen, an idea began to form. He opened his social media app, something he rarely used for anything other than family updates. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Did he really want to share what had just happened? Then he thought about that couple. He thought about how many times people like them had weaponized lies and prejudice against people like him, confident that no one would ever hold them accountable. This time, James decided, they wouldn't get away with it. His thumbs moved quickly as he began to type. "After 6 years of working as a waiter, I was fired today because of a racist complaint. A couple accused me of being rude and inappropriate, which is absolutely untrue. I've always treated my customers with kindness and respect. I'm sharing this because I know I'm not the only one who's faced injustice like this. It's time to speak out." He paused, rereading his words. Then, with a deep breath, he hit post. James didn't expect much to happen. Maybe a few of his friends or co-workers would see it and share their support. But within hours, his phone began lighting up with notifications. Comments and messages flooded in, some from strangers, others from old high school classmates he hadn't spoken to in years. "This is awful, James. I'm so sorry this happened to you. They can't get away with this. Where is the restaurant? We need to hold them accountable. As a former server, I've seen this kind of thing happen too many times. Stay strong." By the next morning, his post had gone viral. Thousands of people had shared it, and local news outlets were reaching out for interviews. The hashtag number Justice for James began trending, with countless users sharing their own stories of facing racism at work. As James scrolled through the responses, his emotions swung between disbelief and gratitude. People were outraged on his behalf, but more importantly, they were starting a larger conversation about the way systemic racism affected workers in the service industry. Then came the most surprising message of all. A direct message popped up from someone named Laura Summers, whose profile showed her as a journalist for a major online news outlet. "Hi James, I saw your story and would love to interview you. We're working on a piece about discrimination in the workplace, and I think your voice would be an important part of it." James hesitated. He had never been the kind of person to put himself in the spotlight, but he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. If his story could shed light on the injustices so many others faced, then it was worth stepping out of his comfort zone. He replied, "I'd be happy to share my story. Let me know how we can connect." The next few days were a whirlwind. James gave interviews to journalists and appeared on local news segments, each time recounting the events of that fateful night with raw honesty. He didn't hold back when discussing how racism had shaped not just his firing, but his entire experience in the service industry. Meanwhile, the backlash against Riverside Bistro grew louder. Former employees came forward, sharing their own experiences of mistreatment and bias at the restaurant. Customers began leaving one-star reviews online, calling out the establishment for its handling of James's case. Faced with mounting public pressure, Riverside Bistro released a statement. "We are deeply committed to providing an inclusive and respectful environment for all. We are investigating the recent events involving a former employee and will take appropriate action." But James wasn't satisfied with a vague promise of change. He wanted something tangible, an acknowledgement of the injustice done to him, and a commitment to prevent it from happening to others. As the movement grew, an unexpected ally emerged. Rachel Carter, one of the restaurant's former managers. She reached out to James, saying she had quit her position months earlier due to similar issues with how complaints were handled. "When I saw what happened to you, I couldn't stay silent anymore," Rachel told him over coffee one afternoon. "I still have access to some internal records, and I think you need to see them." James's heart raced. "What kind of records?" Rachel leaned in, lowering her voice. "Documents showing how complaints have been ignored or exaggerated based on who they were against. You weren't the first person this happened to, James, but you might be the one who finally gets them to answer for it." For the first time since he was fired, James felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. James stared at the stack of documents Rachel had handed him. The papers were thick with highlighted sections, notes in the margins, and email chains between restaurant management and corporate executives. With each page he read, his anger grew. The evidence was damning. It revealed a pattern of discrimination and unfair treatment that went beyond James's firing. Complaints about minority employees were escalated without proper investigation, while complaints against white employees were quietly dismissed. Several staff members of color had been let go for dubious reasons, often following similar accusations of being rude or inappropriate. "This is unbelievable," James muttered, running a hand over his face. Rachel nodded solemnly. "I kept these documents because I knew something like this would happen again. I just didn't know it would happen to someone like you." "Someone like me?" James asked. "Someone who wouldn't let them get away with it," Rachel said with a small smile. "You've got people on your side, James. Use this." James's mind raced as he thought about his next steps. He didn't just want his job back. He wanted to hold Riverside Bistro accountable for what they had done to him and others. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing up for every worker who had been silenced or dismissed because of their race. He spent the next few days gathering everything he needed. He compiled Rachel's documents, printed out screenshots of social media posts from other former employees, and collected messages of support from customers who had witnessed his dedication firsthand. He also reached out to a local civil rights lawyer, Marcus Hall, who had a reputation for taking on high-profile cases. Marcus was a tall man in his early 40s, with a commanding presence and a booming voice. He listened intently as James recounted his story, nodding as he flipped through the documents. "This is strong evidence," Marcus said, setting the papers down. "If we play this right, we could not only get you justice, but also force this company to re-evaluate its entire system." James felt a flicker of hope. "What do we do first?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, a determined look in his eyes. "We start with a formal demand letter to Riverside Bistro, outlining your case and requesting a public apology, financial compensation for wrongful termination, and a commitment to overhaul their internal complaint processes." James nodded, his resolve strengthening. "And if they refuse, then we take it to court," Marcus said. "And with the evidence you have, they'll have a hard time winning." The demand letter was sent out the next day, and it didn't take long for the response to come back. Riverside Bistro's legal team denied any wrongdoing, claiming James's termination was justified and refusing to issue an apology. "They're doubling down," James told Marcus over the phone, frustration evident in his voice. "Let them," Marcus replied. "It'll make their fall that much harder." As news of the legal battle spread, public support for James grew. His story was picked up by national media outlets, sparking debates about racism in the workplace and the power dynamics between customers and employees. More former Riverside employees came forward with their own stories, each one adding fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, Riverside Bistro struggled to contain the fallout. Protesters gathered outside their locations, holding signs that read, "Justice for James" and "End Workplace Racism." Social media was flooded with calls to boycott the restaurant, and their once glowing reviews plummeted. But James wasn't done. With Marcus's guidance, he filed a lawsuit against the restaurant for wrongful termination and racial discrimination. The case drew widespread attention, with many seeing it as a test of whether businesses could continue to hide behind vague policies to justify their mistreatment of minority workers. As the court date approached, James felt a mix of nerves and determination. This was bigger than him now. He thought about the countless messages he'd received from strangers, sharing their own stories of injustice, thanking him for speaking out. He carried their voices with him as he prepared to face Riverside Bistro in court. The day of the trial, the courthouse was abuzz with media crews, activists, and onlookers who had followed James's story since it first went viral. As James walked up the courthouse steps alongside his lawyer Marcus, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. Yet, he stood tall, knowing that this fight wasn't just for him. It was for every worker who had suffered in silence. Inside the packed courtroom, James glanced at the faces in the gallery. His mother and sister sat in the front row, their expressions a mix of pride and worry. Behind them were former co-workers, community members, and even strangers who had been moved by his story. On the other side of the room sat Riverside Bistro's legal team, a row of sharply dressed attorneys with stacks of documents in front of them. The company's CEO, a stiff-looking man in his 50s, avoided James's gaze, staring straight ahead. The proceedings began with Marcus delivering a powerful opening statement. He painted a vivid picture of James's years of dedication, the unfairness of his firing, and the systemic racism that had been allowed to fester within Riverside Bistro's management. "This case is about more than a wrongful termination," Marcus said, his voice firm. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what my client endured. A life turned upside down by a lie rooted in prejudice." When it was the defense's turn, their lead attorney argued that James had been terminated in accordance with company policy. They attempted to frame the complaint against him as legitimate and painted the couple who filed it as valued customers with credible concerns. James's heart sank as the defense lawyer described him as unprofessional and disruptive. But he knew the truth would come out soon. Marcus called James to the stand, guiding him through his testimony with care. James spoke honestly about his years at the restaurant, his love for the job, and the pride he took in treating every customer with respect. When he recounted the night of the complaint, his voice faltered slightly, but he held his composure. "I knew the moment I greeted them that something was off," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. Their hostility wasn't about the service. It was about me." The courtroom was silent as James detailed the accusations that led to his firing, the meeting with his manager, and the devastation he felt when he was let go. Then Marcus presented the evidence. He displayed email chains showing how complaints against minority employees were escalated disproportionately, while similar complaints against white employees were dismissed. Testimonies from former co-workers revealed a troubling pattern of racial bias in management decisions. But the most damning piece of evidence was the couple's own social media posts, which Rachel had uncovered shortly after the incident. In one post, the woman bragged about putting that rude waiter in his place, while the man had shared a post laced with overtly racist language about black service workers. When the posts were shown on the courtroom screen, audible gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the judge's expression hardened as he studied the evidence. The defense scrambled to downplay the posts, claiming they were taken out of context, but the damage was done. The jury now had a clear picture of the prejudice that had fueled the complaint against James. In the days that followed, more witnesses took the stand. A regular customer testified about James's impeccable service and kind demeanor. A former co-worker shared her experience of being unfairly disciplined for trivial mistakes, while white employees were given second chances. By the time closing arguments were made, the truth was undeniable. James's firing wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the result of a culture that allowed racism to thrive unchecked. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. James sat with his hands clenched together, his heart pounding as the foreperson stood to read the decision. In the case of James Carter versus Riverside Bistro, we find in favor of the plaintiff. A wave of emotion washed over James. He felt his mother squeeze his hand tightly, and tears welled up in his sister's eyes. The jury awarded James significant financial compensation for wrongful termination and emotional distress, but more importantly, they ordered Riverside Bistro to implement mandatory anti-discrimination training and overhaul their complaint policies. As James left the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters and reporters, he felt a mix of relief and pride. The fight had been long and grueling, but it wasn't just a victory for him. It was a step forward in the larger battle against injustice. In the weeks following the verdict, James's life transformed in ways he never imagined. His name became synonymous with resilience and justice, and his story was shared across national news outlets and social media platforms. While the financial compensation gave him some breathing room, it was the support from strangers and his community that left the deepest impact. People from all walks of life reached out to him. Servers, cashiers, and workers in industries far removed from hospitality sent heartfelt messages. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up. I've faced similar discrimination at my job, but I never thought I could do anything about it. You've inspired me. Thank you for standing up for all of us." James found himself invited to speak at community forums, universities, and even corporate seminars about his experience. He used these opportunities to emphasize the importance of accountability, equity, and treating all workers with respect, regardless of their background. One particular invitation stood out: a request from a national restaurant chain asking him to consult on improving their internal policies. As he sat across from their executives in a sleek boardroom, he felt a mix of pride and disbelief. 6 months ago, he had been fired without a second thought. Now his voice was helping shape policies that would protect workers like him across the country. While James was rebuilding his life, Riverside Bistro struggled to recover from the backlash. The trial had exposed their discriminatory practices to the public, and their reputation took a significant hit. Protesters continued to gather outside their locations, and customers boycotted in droves. In an effort to save face, the company issued a second statement, this time offering a public apology to James and announcing a series of reforms, including mandatory anti-discrimination training and a complete restructuring of their complaint system. But for many, it was too little, too late. Several branches of Riverside Bistro closed within months, unable to recover from the financial and reputational damage. Despite everything he had endured, James refused to let bitterness consume him. He channeled his energy into creating change, co-founding an organization called Voices for Equity, dedicated to supporting workers who face discrimination in the workplace. The nonprofit provided legal resources, advocacy, and a platform for people to share their stories. Through Voices for Equity, James met countless individuals who inspired him. One of them was a young woman named Maria, a waitress who had been fired from her job after refusing the advances of a manager. Her courage reminded James of why he had fought so hard, and he worked tirelessly to help her win her own case. As a fundraiser for the organization, James stood before a crowd of supporters, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I was fired, I thought my world had ended," he said. "But what I learned is that even in the darkest moments, we have the power to create change, not just for ourselves, but for others. This isn't just my story, it's our story, and together we can make sure no one else has to go through what I did." The audience erupted into applause, and James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had come full circle. Years later, James returned to his hometown to visit the small diner where his love for hospitality first began. As he sat at a corner table sipping coffee, he overheard a young server chatting with a customer. Her voice was bright, her laughter infectious, a reminder of the joy James had once found in serving others. Before leaving, James called her over and handed her a generous tip. "Keep being yourself," he said with a smile. "The world needs more people like you." As he walked out into the crisp evening air, James reflected on how far he had come. His journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. By standing up to injustice, he hadn't just changed his own life. He had sparked a movement that would continue to ripple through workplaces, communities, and hearts for years to come. This is a story about courage, justice, and the power of one voice to inspire change. James's journey reminds us that even in the face of adversity, integrity and perseverance can lead to something greater than we ever imagined.